Yesterday, I got into a small parking lot accident. It's small. I was backing out and I felt something. And I was wondering to myself, the car's got sensors, there's a camera, why did I hit something? So I got out of the car, the other guy was backing out too. Yep. So we looked at each other and he says to me, I was backing out, I'm at fault. I said to him, I was backing out, I'm at fault. He goes, Merry Christmas, have a nice day. We'll call it a day. So that was very nice. But it was just like, it's just another thing, right? I was hoping that I would have a nice Advent season where nothing goes wrong. But something always happens. So I hope that nobody gets into accidents this week or in the parking lot. If you're joining us for the first time, I've been teaching a teaching series that is based on my own personal studies in the book of Genesis. That's what I was doing in 2020 when we were locked down. The title of this series is The Faith of God's Family, Lessons in Faithfulness from the book of Genesis. And in this series, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the very first family members in the family of God and hopefully learn from them how to increase and grow our own faith, as well as exercise our faith in even greater and bolder ways than they ever did. For the last 2 weeks, or in the first 2 weeks of this series, we have been talking about two prevailing themes in this series, the theme of family and the theme of faith. In week 1, we talked about the theme of family. We learned in that theme that God is family. How is he family? He's family by his triune nature. He is family in the three persons of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We also learned that a mysterious feature of this family is that it is an adoptive family. It is a family that desires to bring other people into their family. And this is not because 3 is not enough, but because 3 is enough. The family of God, the triune family, is an adoptive family because it is a perfect family where the feature and the desire to adopt flows out of their own perfection. And so as an adoptive family, the triune family now includes men and women like you and me. And this is ultimately made possible because the second person of the Trinity became a man like you and me. And so what does this mean? It means that God didn't merely become a man to live like me. God became a man so that I can live with him in his family. In week 2, we talked about the theme of faith. We said that for those outside of the family of God, faith is often nothing more than a strongly held belief, sometimes one that runs contrary to all available evidence. Richard Dawkins says, even in spite of evidence, that the lack of it gives it faith. But we learn from Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, that faith is not belief in the absence of reason or evidence. Faith in actuality is belief in the presence of a greater kind of reasoning and evidence. What is that reasoning? What is that evidence? It is the reason and evidence of God's own word. Since God is trustworthy, since he is faithful and true, everything that he says will be true, regardless of what he actually says. His own trustworthiness is that reason and evidence. Faith then takes what God says and considers it real, even though it hasn't happened yet. Faith takes what God says and considers it seen, even though it is still invisible. And so when we live by faith, we live in the visible reality of faith, one that is completely different from the present reality that we see. And so as a result, our life, our choices, our behavior, our feelings conform to that hidden reality, the one that only the family of God can see. And we learn from Paul in the book of Hebrews how to recognize a person's faith. When a person's life conforms to the reality of what God has said to them, what God has shown to them, it is a sign and a fruit of their faithfulness. They cannot actually conform to that reality unless we can see that reality as visibly as we see our present reality. In week 3, we talked about the faith of Adam and Eve. Today, we will talk about the faith of Abel. But because there are parallels between the life of Adam and Eve and the life of Abel, I also want us to revisit what we talked about when we talked about the faith of Adam and Eve. When we looked at the faith of Adam and Eve in week 3, we looked at their lives in 4 parts. We looked at God's prohibition, Adam's fall, God's promise, and Adam's faith. Prohibition, fall, promise, on faith. In God's prohibition, we saw that on the 6th day of the creation week, after creating Adam, God plants a garden in the east of the land of Eden. And we saw that this is when the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life was created. These 2 trees were not created on the 3rd day when God had created all the other plants and trees. And after planting this garden in the land of Eden, God tells Adam that he may eat of every tree in the garden, except for one tree. That tree is the tree that is in the midst of the garden, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So what does God mean when he tells Adam that he may eat of every tree? In fact, in Genesis chapter 1, that is all we're told about what God said to Adam. There is no prohibition in Genesis chapter 1. What this tells us is that what God means is that the purpose of plants and the purpose of trees is that they are for eating. What this tells us is that the purpose of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is also for eating. So what kind of prohibition is this? But just because something is edible, just because something can be eaten, doesn't mean that you can eat it right now. We understand this as parents. Never had a child as a baby, but I have some sense of the biology behind it. When you are a parent raising a baby, you know that your baby cannot eat everything right away. Even though vegetables are edible, even though meat is edible, the first thing that you feed your baby is milk. And then soon afterward, then they can eat some soft foods like vegetables. And then when they grow their teeth, they can begin to eat meat. Adam in the Garden of Eden is like a child. He is not ready to eat of that tree that is in the midst of the garden. Maybe in time as he grows, he might be able to have the knowledge of good and evil. But right now, Adam has to wait. So this teaches us that this is a temporary prohibition. And this fits the name of the tree. The tree is called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This is a knowledge that we know that we have to grow and mature into having. As children, we first start off being told exactly what is right and wrong by our parents. But as we learn from our parents, as we're being told, we gradually learn how to decipher what is right and wrong in new situations. And so, when will Adam begin to have that kind of knowledge? When he first eats of the other trees. This is why there are two trees. For Adam to learn first to eat of the tree that is first given, the tree of life, before approaching the tree that God prohibits him from having. So God intends for Adam to learn how to eat of that tree, to mature before he can approach the second tree. And what this tells us is that the key to growing and maturing and to walking and approaching that tree is restraint. It's waiting. And this is what is required to really have the wisdom to decipher good and evil. Interestingly enough, immediately what happens after God prohibits Adam and Eve from eating of that tree, God says to himself, it is not good for man to be alone. Why? It's not good for him to be alone, to resist the tree by himself. He needs the help of a person to help him to wait, to restrain himself. And so what does God do? God creates a helper for Adam. This tells us that the purpose of wives is to restrain their husbands from reaching for things that they should not reach for, is to help them mature into wisdom. Funny enough, I'm pretty sure there's some of you wives sitting out there right now saying to yourself, yeah, where would my husband be without me? Then we took a look at Adam's fall. Because Eve was Adam's helper, a serpent comes into the garden to test whether Eve will be helpful or hurtful. And Eve recalls what Adam taught her. She said to the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree of the garden, the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die. But the serpent challenges Eve. What does the serpent say? But the serpent said to the woman, you will not surely die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So Eve looked at that tree. She saw that the food was what? It was good, delightful, and wise. These are all good things, she thought to herself. So she took it and she ate it. We later see that Adam stood by the whole time in silence as he watched the serpent talk to Eve, and Eve talked to the serpent, and Eve probably turned to Adam waiting for him to say something. He doesn't say anything. In fact, Adam waited for Eve to eat of that fruit to see if she would really die. And so when he saw that she did not die and she handed the fruit over to him, he ate of it too. And after eating, Adam and Eve realized in their nakedness that what they did was evil. They hid from God. They finally obtained the knowledge of good and evil, but before their time. But God brings a promise to them. And as a consequence of murdering Adam and Eve, he makes a promise to Adam and Eve in a statement to the serpent. He tells the serpent that the serpent will have enmity with Eve. He did not really win by deceiving her. He will continue to struggle against her. And this enmity will continue between his children and her children. His offspring will hurt her children, but Eve's offspring will ultimately defeat him and kill him once and for all. This is a message to Eve that she will be avenged for the serpent's deception. And the way that she will be avenged is through a son. This also means, we saw, that she will not immediately die, but live to have a son. And so after pronouncing these consequences on Adam and Eve and this promise, God clothes them with clothes made of skin. And we saw that this doesn't quite make sense, because shortly after they ate of that fruit, they already made for themselves clothes from fig leaves. So what's the problem here? Didn't they already have clothes? What this tells us is that God had to clothe them because their own clothes that they made out of their own work and their own hands is not enough to clothe them. Because they have skin, they must be clothed with skin, not with plants. And in order to make these clothes, God had to kill an animal to do it. And so this taught Adam and Eve that in order to be with God, in order to remain in his presence, something has to die. And that something has to die in order so that it can give its skin to them. So when God told Adam not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, what did Adam do? Because he did not believe that he would actually die. Because he believed that he could obtain knowledge of good and evil now, he ate. But now that God has promised victory, what will Adam do with what God says? And so we looked at Adam's faith. After immediately hearing the promise, even before they are clothed, Adam names his wife Eve. What does this mean? She is the mother of all living. And we saw that this is not the first time that Adam named Eve. This is actually the second time. Adam had already named Eve in Genesis chapter 1. And when he named her woman, meaning taken out of me. And it was true, she was taken out of him. So why does he rename her? He renames her for the reason why the future patriarchs are renamed. Sarah is renamed Sarai. Abram is renamed Abraham. Jacob is renamed Israel. And they are renamed because they have received a promise. And so he names her according to that promise. No longer is she a woman of death. She is a woman of life. Adam could not have named her Eve unless he believed what God said he would do through Eve. And so what does Adam do? He goes on to have 3 children: Cain, Abel, and Seth. You think that everything goes well, but Abel gets murdered by Cain. And Cain gets exiled from the land. Now, if you were in Adam's shoes, does this sit well with what God said? It seems like it's not fitting well with what God said. I thought that my offspring would crush the head of the serpent, not the other way around. And yet this did not produce any doubt with Adam. After the death of Abel, Adam continues to have another child with Eve in belief of that promise. We also took a look at the faith of Eve. When Eve gives birth to Cain, she credits God with the help. not Adam. Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. Eve cannot credit God unless she understood that God is the keeper of his promise. Even after Abel dies, Eve still credits God's help with the birth of Seth. And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth. For she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. Even when Abel was murdered, Eve understood that God would replace Abel with another son because of his promise. This is why she says that God has appointed. It was appointed to her in that original promise that her offspring would crush the head of the serpent. Again, it appears that it's the other way around. Cain crushed Abel. Her present reality and present circumstances of Adam and Eve would tell you that it doesn't seem like God's promise would come true. It looks like the serpent's offspring crushes her offspring. And yet, Adam and Eve did all of these things by faith. And so we learn from them, we learn from Adam that faith believes God. And we learn from Eve that faith credits God. Now we come to Abel. Let's look at Abel and see what he teaches us about faith. We find the account of Abel's life in Genesis chapter 4. Would you turn there with me? We're not going to look at the whole thing because most of chapter 4 is focused on Cain and not Abel. But if we read closely, we'll be able to glean what God intends to teach us about Abel. So we're going to look at this passage verse by verse. Let's take a look at verses 1 through 2. I'll read it to you. Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 through 2. Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again, she bore his brother Abel. So we're told that Eve gives birth to Cain first. And then at a later time, she gives birth to Abel. This is interesting because at first glance, it may appear that the reason why the two are mentioned at the very beginning of this chapter is to set up the conflict. But why would Eve have a second child at all? Consider what promise was given to her. When Eve was told that her offspring would crush the head of the serpent, it would have been reasonable to believe that when she had Cain, that was the offspring. She may have believed, and there are many commentators that think that is truly what she believed. So why does she have a second son? If the first, in light of what little she knew about the promise, should have been able to fulfill that promise, why did she give birth to Abel at all? And we'll see that it's probably because that as Cain grew up, she realized that Cain was not really her offspring, but it was the offspring of the serpent, that he was a murderer in his heart. This is not revealed to us until later, when Cain actually crushes Abel's head. Cain is a murderer like his real father, the serpent, who murdered Adam and Eve. And so she probably gives birth to Abel in hopes that he will be the true offspring that will really crush the head of the serpent. Let's look at Genesis chapter 4, verse 2, second half of verse 2. And again, she bore his brother Abel. Now, Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. Again, we might think that we're told this verse to kind of give us some sense of why Abel and Cain offered what they did. But this verse actually gives us a greater sense of what is actually going on. It's meant to make us feel uneasy about the situation, especially in light of what we know already about plants and the ground and about animals. So consider what is known already up until this point. We know that plants were created first, and then animals were created second. So this verse becomes significant in light of its order. Okay? In light of the order of plants and in light of the order of animals. We see later in the New Testament that order is very significant. Order is so significant that it becomes the reason why Paul does not permit a man to have permit a woman to have authority over a man, because Adam came first. And then when God created Adam, he gives us the order of creation in relationship to Adam. Plants first, and then animals second. God creates Adam. Adam watches as God plants a garden in the midst of Eden. God puts Adam into the garden to work and to keep that garden, to keep the plant. And then in the garden, God brings the animals for Adam to name. So Adam becomes a gardener first, and he becomes a shepherd second. He becomes a keeper of animals second.
Have a good day.
And then there's an order in the fall. Plants first, animals second. In the fall, Adam and Eve reach for plants. God reaches for an animal. In the tabernacle, there is also an order of plants and animals, one that may be hard to see. But in the order of the tabernacle, the order of redemption, now that we have fallen, the order is reversed. When you approach God in the tabernacle, it's animals first, and then plants. In the tabernacle, when you enter, the first things that are sacrificed are plants. We see this in Leviticus chapter 1 and chapter 2. First thing that's sacrificed are animals. See that in Leviticus chapter 1. The second thing that is sacrificed are plants as they're laid on top of the animals, Leviticus chapter 2. And when you pass through the outer court and into the holy place, there are only symbols of plants. There are no symbols of animals. Remember that there is a lampstand in the shape of an almond tree, and there are products of plants, a table of bread. And so, what does this show us? It shows us that in the presence of God before the fallen order, it's plants first and animals second. But in order to approach God again, it's animals first, plants second. And so as the firstborn son of Cain, Cain should have not become a worker of the ground. Cain should have become a shepherd. This is even more interesting because the curse that is given to Adam is explicitly a curse of the ground. And we're told in the very similar language that Cain is a worker of the ground, maybe even a slave of the ground. To re-enter into God's presence, Cain should have been the shepherd that tended to sheep to re-offer them as sacrifices to God in order to enter into God's presence. But instead, it's Abel, the younger brother, who has matured into this knowledge. Look at me with verses 3 through 4. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. And Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. We read here that Cain and Abel brought offerings to the Lord. Brought them to where? It's kind of unusual language. Bring them where? They could have done them anywhere. This is speculation on my part, but I think it's likely that where they took the offerings to was the east of Eden, where they were banished. And this makes sense because this is most likely where they associate God's presence, in the Garden of Eden. And they were banished from the east side of the Garden of Eden, where there is a gate and a door held by an angel. You later see a reference to a door when God says to Cain, sin crouches at the door, probably talking about that door. No, we immediately notice that what Cain and Abel brings to God is a product of their occupation and their work. Cain brings fruits of the ground. Why? Because he is a worker of the ground. Abel brings a first of his flock and the fat of his flock because he is a shepherd. Cain brings fruit, Abel brings sheep. We also see that Abel's offering differs from Cain in two ways. Verse 4. And Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. So the first way that it differs is that Abel brings the firstborn of his flock. He sets here an example that carries on throughout the rest of redemptive history, that God will require an offering and a tithe of the firsts of the fruits of our labor. But I don't think we quite fully grasp what that means, how difficult it is to offer to God the first things that are made out of our labor. It's a little harder for us to grasp it because we don't live in such scarcity. But if you were living in agricultural times and barely learning how to propagate animals, learning how to harvest fruits and vegetables, when you get your first round of vegetables, when you first get your first round of flock, there's no guarantee that you're going to get a second. You don't really know if another harvest is coming. And you want to be able to live off the very first of what you have. What does Abel do? He gives to God the very first of what he has. He also gives to God the fattiest portions of his flock. This may not be a detail that is relevant to us right now, but this becomes a clue later on in the book of Leviticus. In Leviticus chapter 3, we see that the fattiest portion of an animal sacrifice is reserved for God. We also later see that the great sin of the sons of Eli is that they reserve the fattiest portions for themselves. So great is this sin that God punishes the entire house of Eli forever. So this is a clue that there's something more going on here than just Cain not offering the first, than just Cain not offering the best. Abel understands something by faith far superior to Cain. Abel understands what is really required in order to come into the presence of God. Cain should have known what God really required. Then God cursed the ground. Why bring fruit of the ground? Then God killed an animal in order to clothe their parents. I think that Cain did know better. But he hated his brother from the beginning. He hated his brother so much that he could not go to his brother and ask him, "Can I buy a sheep from you to offer to?" He instead wanted to offer God the fruit of his own work, the fruit of his own labor. But that is not acceptable to God. We see this more significantly in the New Testament and how it refers to Abel. And so when Abel offered this sacrifice of blood to God, he was prophesying to Cain what was really required. This is why when Jesus was talking to the teachers of his day, this is what he says to them in Luke chapter 11, verses 50 to 51. The wisdom of God said, "I will send them prophets and apostles, some of them whom they will kill and persecute, so that the blood of all the prophets shed from the foundation of the world may be charged against this generation, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, I tell you, it will be required of this generation." Interestingly enough, Zechariah dies between the altar and the sanctuary. Abel dies outside of the gate of the Garden of Eden, the place where Cain and Abel offered sacrifices. This is why God finds Abel acceptable and his offering acceptable. Look with me at verse 4. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. Notice the language. It doesn't say, and for Abel he had regard, and for Cain he had regard. His regard is for both the person and the offering. What does this tell us? This tells us you cannot approach God with just quote unquote good intentions. You cannot come into that sanctuary and sing whatever you want to sing. You cannot go to that sanctuary and give as the Lord's Supper whatever elements you want to give. There are some things that are acceptable and some things that are not acceptable. Abel understands by faith what God really requires from us. And because he understands that, brings the actual thing that is required. What does Abel teach us? Abel teaches us that in order to come into God's presence, something has to die for me. In doing so, Abel prophesies to Cain what is required of him. But Cain would not have it. So who did he sacrifice instead? He sacrificed Abel. This is significant. Abel is the younger brother, and Abel is the brother that is sacrificed for Cain. Throughout the rest of redemptive history, we will see that it is the younger brother that saves the older. We see in the sons of Abraham that the real son is the second son. We see in the sons of Israel that the son that saves the entire family is the youngest son, Joseph. And we see in Jesus, the youngest of all sons, the true son that will save us all. Jesus is the greater Abel. He doesn't just bring the sacrifice of an animal. He brings the sacrifice of himself. Blood first and plant second. So that when Jesus was risen again, he was mistaken as a gardener. Why? Because he was gardening. Because he has brought us back into the presence of God. Let us pray. Lord, we thank you for the faith of Abel. Abel, although knowing that his brother hated him, continued to obey you. In light of our hymn this morning, to trust and obey. To prophesy to him that what is required for us to come into your presence is blood, is sacrifice, is death. Something must die, or we must die. He did it anyway, all the while knowing that his brother was a murderer. In the same way, our younger brother Jesus also came to trust and obey. He came to obey anyway, even though his older brothers would seek to kill him. But in doing so, he offered to us a greater sacrifice so that we can re-enter that garden. Lord, we trust, not in promise anymore, but in reality. That sacrifice is done once and for all. We can finally walk back into your presence. And we do it boldly this morning as we pray it in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.